Welcome to Jefferson Liberty Radio, the voice of the state of Jefferson in the Central Valley. I'm Matthew, and as always, joined by Alan. How are you doing, Alan?
I'm doing good. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Pat, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Matthew. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. Alan, take it away.
Well, welcome, folks. We're glad to have you listening. This is Jefferson Liberty Radio, the podcast that digs down deep to get to the bottom so that you can stay on top. And we're very happy today to have with us a gentleman from Modesto by the name of John Walker. And he is currently on the Modesto City School Board and is now the chair. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Alan.
Hi, John.
Hi, Pat. And so before we get too far, I want to do a quick, as Alan just mentioned, I am president of the Board of Education. I'll do a quick disclaimer that my opinions tonight are my own, and they don't represent the opinion of the Board of Education or the City of Modesto Schools, so that I can stay out of trouble.
Nice job.
Well, as you can guess from that disclaimer, we're going to be talking about education, but not only John's experience in education here in Stanislaus County, but also for potentially the state of Jefferson. Well, John, could you give us a little background on yourself? How did you get involved with education?
And so I've always sort of had a real passion for education, and it's sort of how I ended up working in the job I am. I'm a software engineer, do research and development with NASA. And prior to that, I was working at Safeway and many other jobs, and education is what sort of changed my life and put me on that track. And then when my daughters started to get older and got into elementary school, there's something called school site councils. And so every individual school in California has what's called a school site council, composed of the principal, some teachers, and parents. And I was doing that for about 6 or 7 years. And then I got involved a bit in city politics. And then my wife said, come back home, stop messing around at City Hall and do education. I don't think she exactly meant the school board, but we're working that out over the years. But yes, I decided after seeing Dr. Stotsky and Professor Milgram at the Common Core Unveil event in Modesto City Center back in 2014, the question I asked Dr. Stotsky was, well, what do I do as a parent to try to make a difference? And her answer was, get parents elected to the school board. And so I said, okay, I'll take her advice. And lo and behold, 2015, 10,000 houses later, I'm on the school board.
Well, that's a good way to get involved. I'm glad you took that advice.
Yes, I am too, John. I'm glad you're on that board of education.
Well, obviously, certainly when you ran for school board, you must have had a goal of some sort. Can you tell us a little bit about your goals?
I had 3 at the time. And the idea then was my biggest, and still one of my biggest issues, is what we're doing with math. And it was clear from Dr. Stotsky and Professor Milgram that the Common Core math was a wreck. And it still is, and that was one of the pieces I wanted to fix. The second piece I was after was I was really worried then because at that point the California Assembly was working on the FAIR Act, which is the piece that everybody gets upset about, sex ed all the way down to second grade. And that was my other goal, was to only do what the state requires, which is 1 year in junior high and 1 year in high school, and get it out of the elementary schools. That's actually a goal I've accomplished. With the support of my board, we have now removed comprehensive sex ed out of the elementary schools. And that's a result of California's bad policies. When I spoke with you guys at your last meeting, I talked about bad policies hurting our children. That policy, the way California is written, it says, if you're going to do it, you have to do all of it or none of it. And so the choice for our board was all or nothing. All is too much. And as I said at your meeting a month or so ago, I also think nothing is the wrong answer, because I think you still need to talk to 5th, 6th, and 7th graders about hygiene and health. And you are in puberty, and you are changing. And you can do that the way we did when we were kids and do it reasonably. But California said, no, you're going to go all in or all out. And then the third piece was getting back to sort of looking at AP classes. I am not a big fan of AP classes because we talked about the college. We talked about Dr. Stotsky and Professor Milgram and Common Core. The chief architect of Common Core is David Coleman. And him with Bill Gates and Arne Duncan and the Obama administration put that together. Well, David Coleman is now the president of the College Board, which means that same guy that put this together is now in charge of SAT tests and all the AP courses, which to me means they're collecting data. And it wasn't that long ago the New York Times wrote about how the SAT was taking people's data off the surveys when the kids took the test and selling it to the colleges. And so what I would really like to do at some point, if it's possible, I've learned it's a bit harder than it looks, is to look at our junior colleges and do sort of dual tracking and allow kids to take junior college courses at high school and get real college credit while at high school instead of taking an AP course. Because the AP courses, if you pass the test with the right score, you'll get college credit, maybe, depending on the school.
Well, that just seems to just make sense. What? You're making sense.
That is what I try to do. It's a hard sell because the brand is what you're fighting against. You're fighting against the brand of AP. And I think that that's the real issue is, and then the flip side is what I've done with my daughter is that she tells me I don't have time to take an online course because I'm too busy with my regular studies. And so it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. But I think the real rub is that California is also, we're not passed legislation that says that if we create college courses and we can work with the local junior college to have them approve them, our teachers could then theoretically teach a college course at the high schools. But again, another very heavy lift. But those were sort of the three things I ran on. Math, getting sex ed out of elementary school that's comprehensive, and looking at a different way other than AP to allow our kids to accelerate.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the sex ed, your second goal. Was that a decision to bring it down into the grammar school arena, the city's decision, or was that a state decision?
The California Assembly made that decision for everybody. When they passed, it was legislation, I can't think of the gentleman's name. He was an assemblyman from San Francisco that if everybody heard his name, you'd recognize it. He used to be a county soup up there. Ended up in the assembly. Him and another guy wanted to do this idea that we really do push sex ed, gender fluidity, all this sort of monkey business, for lack of a better term, into very, very young grades. And they did that. And so what happened is we were already doing this fairly similar like we just talked about. We were talking to children about puberty and adolescence and how you take care of yourself. And then the rules changed. And so then you came up to this point where do you do all of it or nothing? And a complaint was made that we weren't doing all. And so then we had to answer a complaint. And so when somebody starts complaining, it wasn't necessarily the board's doing, but one of Marie's friend I really like, PJI, lawyer, I'm trying to think of his name. Oh, it's escaping me, but he's the lawyer for Pacific Justice Institute. Begins with a D, but his point was if you can get somebody to complain, it forces a decision. Yeah. And so it wasn't our doing, it was somebody that said we weren't doing all. And so then choice came back, all or nothing, and as a board, we made the decision all was too much. And I think it was the right decision. But it's no different. Fremont did the same thing. Fremont Unified School District has also pulled it out of their K through 6 curriculum. And so it ends up being a really difficult decision to put a board member in. Because how do you do something when you know you should, but if you do anything, you're going to do too much? Brad Dawkins. Yes, Brad Dawkins. And he's just been a real good guy to sort of follow, because I think when you force a legal issue or a complaint issue, you can't pass. You have to make a decision as a board. And I think we will come back and revisit this at some point. because I don't think it holds forever, but it's easier to start where we're at and say, look, we've done the right thing.
Yeah.
And then hope that there's some way to use school nurses or some middle ground, because I do think children need to be aware of their bodies. Yes. And that's what we were told in school. We don't have to go all the way down the road to full tilt boogie. You know,
yeah.
where's, and it's part of how I get in trouble is I look for middle ground. Why does everything have to be an extreme? Where does local control come back to? Right?
Yeah.
Make good decisions. I'm answerable to the voters. If you allow me and my fellow board members or any board of education to make the decisions, if you don't like them, you have the ability to toss us out at the next election. That's a lot different than telling us we don't have a choice. You're going to do what we say, whether we like it or not.
Yeah. Well, now that you're the president of the Modesto City School Board, how do you think you can change or modify policy for our city schools?
The hope is we continue on the path we're on. And right now, for the first time in my sort of 3 years, we're a year after last year's elections. And so we have newly elected board members. We just hired a new superintendent 6 months ago. And so we've sort of got an entirely new governance team. We've got some members that have been around for 20 years and some that have been around for 8. And then you've got me and a couple of others. But it's a new team. And we're working well together. And we just passed a bond. And so the elementary district, which has schools that are 50, 60 years old, they're in great disrepair. And so we got $131 million in bond money that the local paper did not endorse.
I saw that.
Love my local paper. That was being very sarcastic. But we did. And so the idea is to manage that and prove them wrong. That we can do really good work and we can improve these schools and upgrade them. They're just in terrible shape. I've been working for the last year to upgrade our policy manual and our bylaws, which are woefully out of date. As we update the policies, it's also an opportunity to educate my other fellow board members that this really is where we have the ability to make change. Because if you look at the current policy manual, some of the education and sort of instruction policies go back to the 80s. That's pre-No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
Okay? So California, as much as it drives me crazy, if you actually understand the ed codes that are underneath it, we've got a lot of flexibility. And so we're updating policies. Superintendent is now looking at the data that I've been talking about for years and saying that, this isn't working the way we want it to. And so she's going to come back with a plan in the spring. And so when we look at her plan towards addressing, first off, I gave up my baby, and my baby was math. And so I've set math aside again to focus on English language arts and literacy. We've got 7,000 English learners in Modesto City's elementary district. That's a lot of children trying to learn how to speak English. If we can't clear that hurdle, how do we get to math? And so I took the advice of my superintendent. We're going to work on math on the side. English language literacy is coming first. Her plan to sort of bring things together and sort of turn this big ship and manage the bond. That's a lot in 1 year to try to chew on already.
Right.
But if we develop consensus and we say 7 wide, in the sense that all 7 board members agree with where we're doing and listen to the community who wants change and wants things to get better, and we deliver that to the community, then we're in a much better place to do bigger things down the road. So I think it's setting the table. My previous board president set the table for us to make the change and hire the new superintendent. We all did that together as a team. But she set the table. And so now my job as president is to continue that move, continue to build consensus, build trust within the community, and do the best we can for these children. School board members are the only elected people in the state of California to represent children. The only ones, and that should be our primary focus.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
John, I'm sure glad to know that you're going to handle that bond money responsibly because, we as conservatives don't like the idea of bonds. So I'm glad we're going to hold your feet to the fire on that one.
No, it's tricky because I think, and it's very difficult here because even when you look at what they did locally here with the road tax, Right? They had all these different things they said that were going to be in place to protect this, that, and the other. There'd be no monkey business, citizen oversight. You pick up the paper and it's just wrecked.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so one of the things I advocated for early on in this process was a contract with a company called OpenGov. And so what OpenGov does is takes all your financial data and loads it up onto a web-based platform. And so what the community will be able to see is where the money's moving. And you won't necessarily have to come to a meeting. If this works the way I foresee it and the way it was pitched, is that you'll be able to go online from the Modesto City Schools website and get to the OpenGov platform and see what we're doing, where we're doing it at, and how the money's being spent. And if we achieve that, that's a huge deal locally because there's so much distrust.
Understandably so. Not because of what anything you've done.
And you're right.
You know that
the lack of trust has been well earned.
Yes. One thing I just want to ask you real quick. That's OpenGov. OpenGov.com.
Yeah. So if you Google OpenGov, you'll see their company.
Okay.
And they work with different cities and districts. Mostly cities, but they're moving into the education realm. And then my hope is after they they're loading the financial data up now. Yeah. I've been told I'll be able to play with it after Christmas and start really working with it. I'm a software guy. And then the next step is to load up all the education data. And so we'll have the financial data there and the academic data there. And I like pictures. I think it's much easier to show somebody a whole lot of data in a picture and a graph.
Visuals are very good, yes.
And visuals are much easier to tell a story with than me rambling off 500 stats that are in my head and confusing people.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's the real goal. Why I love it is that if they deliver on what they say they can do, then we've got a very powerful tool to communicate with the community with, and build trust. Without trust, we can't do anything big.
That's true. Yeah, and I know you're very data oriented. What kinds of data are you analyzing, and what do you hope to achieve from the data? Or with the data.
So here's where I get in trouble again, right? Because I am a staunch proponent antagonist to the testing. I one of the things I also ran on was that the SBAC, which is the annual test, was built to fail, and it was.
Just for my clarification, John, does that mean teachers who teach to the tests? Is that what you mean by the test you don't like?
Well, there's part of that. It's two pieces. The test is the data, and I have friends, and I don't disagree with them, that it's not an assessment test. They're calling it an assessment of English language arts and math. In reality, it's a data collection tool, which is part of what really bothers me is because you're collecting data on children. And it's very similar. If you turn on the news, they're collecting data everywhere. Facebook ads, you go Google something, it shows up on your Facebook feed. Now think about this in the classroom with a captive audience. Okay? Now you've got a different issue, but the test data is readily available. And you can see it from the California Department of Education. There's a new website that's been up for a couple of years now, and it's called EdData, CaliforniaEdData.org. And it's very visual. And it lets me look at every single score and every single graph. And so you can pick up trends. And before we started the podcast, I talked about the issues we face in Modesto aren't specific to the Valley. They're everywhere. Right. 6.5 out of every 10 students in California is below grade level in math. We're 5-6 years into this process. In the last 4 years, the state of California spent over $255.1 billion on education.
That much?
And it's more than that because I don't have this year's numbers. Because EdData has last year's numbers, I just doubled last year for this year because the books aren't closed. I know we spent more because if you turn on Ed News, they'll tell you the local control funding formula is fully funded now. Different argument, different subject. Point was they added more money. And so when I doubled the previous year, I didn't add enough. But it's all I've got to work with. So we are $255.1 billion into Common Core implementation in California. 6.5 out of every 10 students is below grade level on math. 5 out of every 10 is below grade level on English language arts. And it's not getting any better. And so I use the data I'm looking at to make my point. Facts matter. And so instead of losing people in these really deep arguments about philosophy, just look at the numbers. They're not hard to find anymore. They used to be much more difficult. I've got reams of folders in my office at home. But now that the data site is up, which is where I got the idea about OpenGov, one leads to the other. And that's sort of how my mind works. I look for solutions. Where's a model I can work with? It's the engineer in me. We don't reinvent the wheel. We figure out how to use it better. And so you can see every score on English language arts, on math. You can see AP rules. You can see who's taking different scoring. And you can make the point that it has not worked. It is not working. And there's no indication out there that it's changing. And that's how I use data to try to tell the story to people who aren't necessarily paying attention. And it's difficult because moms and dads know what's going on. Ask any student what they think about math now.
Right.
It's miserable. And then people will go, well, it was always miserable. It was never this miserable.
No.
And we don't teach cursive anymore and things like this. And so there's a whole host of issues out there. But the data really helps me because when I first got elected, it was the first year of testing. Well, now we're 4 years in. We're 90 days away from the 5th year of testing. You can't tell me, wait a minute anymore.
That's right.
It's not, okay, give it a minute. We're 5 years in. This year's testing. And so that's how I try to use data to tell a story.
Do you think it's being well accepted by school administrators or even the rest of your board?
It's a slow crawl. We're getting there. I think it's. I don't think anybody agrees with me on the test because I'm brutal on the test. Because to me, it's never been validated and it's never been verified. It was put in place. It was designed by Coleman and his crew. It was funded by Bill Gates. And my contention was it was built to fail. And it is failing because the idea back then was, and here's the trick, if the test fails the children, then we've already put computers in the classrooms because you have to take the test on the computer. The vendors will now come back and tell you, we know how to fix this. Buy more stuff. Right?
Yes.
So the money trail starts.
Follow the money.
And now follow the money.
Yeah.
And so now you're buying more stuff, but it doesn't solve the problem. And so it was I think it was a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, a guy named McCrae, who used to write tests for McGraw-Hill, challenged them and said it needs to be independently validated and verified. Well, they had a company called AIR do it. Well, AIR is a subsidiary and a contractor to SBAC. Why would you have one of your contractors audit you?
Yeah.
Is this the fox watching the hen house?
Yep.
Yes.
And so that's what they've done. And so there's a disagreement between me and the board on the test. I don't think there's a disagreement as much anymore. We'll see when we get there. But I do think folks are coming to my belief that we've made some mistakes on math. And I think we're talking about English language arts and going back to phonics and an emphasis on decoding language. Because underneath Common Core is what's called discovery. And the idea behind discovery is if you hand them a book, they'll figure out how to read. Doesn't quite work that way, right? It's very similar in math. They put them in groups, you discover it. You don't discover math, you learn math. But with decoding, if you teach children how to decode language over phonics, then they learn mentally how to do it. And it was an interesting article I read not too long ago, the way the mind works. We learn how to speak naturally. So children learn how to speak naturally because they copy mom and dad and they just absorb it. Reading doesn't work that way. Your brain doesn't learn how to read by osmosis. You have to be taught. And the way to teach reading is through decoding language and phonics and how sounds work together. And I think we're heading in that direction. And then we'll go to math. And my hope there is we get rid of the integrated math, which is math in a bag, and go back to a traditional approach of Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, pre-calculus.
Tiny steps is what you're saying. Is that right?
Correct. Because I think one of the things I've learned in 3 years is like anything in government, it's like watching grass grow in a drought, right? Because it's very, very slow.
Yep.
And you think about our founding fathers, and one of the things that sort of Jefferson talked about was how difficult it is to get three people in a room to agree on anything.
Yeah.
Which is what's so phenomenal about our Constitution is you got all these folks in the room together and agreed. Sit on the board and see how hard it is to get 4 people to agree on something that's controversial.
You know, you're right there. I've never had to do that before, so John. So that I can understand it though. The way you've explained it, I can understand it.
Because I have a lot of folks that say, "Well, why haven't you done more?" And you can't. And I think you mix in just all the different things that go with governance. You have to labor contracts. You know, you've got parents screaming. You've got the state saying, "We've given you everything you could ever need. Why aren't you doing better?" Because you gave me a bad plan. And it's not working, and it's going to take time to tell people and prove to people it's not working. Mm-hmm. But it goes to relinquishing local control. We don't have to, but I think to your point, Alan, when you talk about administrators and superintendents, I think the natural instinct is to do what you're told. The hard thing is to not do what you're told. The hard thing is to push back and say no.
What? You mean do the right thing? Is that what you're saying? Oh,
it just is, because you have to push back against those telling you what they think is going to work because they've taken the contributions in Sacramento or the money's poured in from Bill Gates. Nonprofits don't exist in a bubble. They exist on money. Nonprofits get their money from profits. Yeah. Where do those profits come from? When you talk about the computers we were talking about before, that's Microsoft, that's Apple, that's HP, that's all the different vendors out there that are pushing products that want it in the classroom because you have a captive audience. 6 million students in California. Multiply that times a computer.
Oh, wow.
Now it settles, right?
Right.
We're fighting a monster.
Yeah, that's for sure.
With decisions being made by the State Board of Education, who was appointed, not elected. And so they're not accountable to the people.
Go into that, John.
And so what you have is the California Constitution sets up the governance of education with a state superintendent of public instruction who has very little power. That job in the recent election was the most expensive ever. His job is to run the California Department of Education. He doesn't have decision-making authority. Decision-making authority rests with the State Board of Education, who's appointed by the governor, approved by the assembly, and where we're at in California is a single-party government rule. And so everybody sitting there was appointed by the governor, approved by a Democratic assembly, on the payroll for an education plan that was put in place by a Democratic president, Obama.
Yep.
But understand, he just took it to the next level because Bush made it worse with No Child Left Behind. Prior to him, Clinton put pieces in place. Prior to that, Bush 1 put things. This goes back to Reagan. Every president since Reagan has done something detrimental to education at the federal level that pushed this test-based, standardized education thing. And so now you have a state board just pushing. The president has retired. The state board president is retired. And so he'll be replaced. The problem is I can tell you who that is without ever asking a question. It will likely be a state board member, Burr, who is no different than the outgoing president, Kirst. And so it will be the same old song and dance. And my guess is Gavin will appoint somebody to replace Kirst that will push for his plan, which is to involve education at 3 years old to death. He essentially wants to track children. He said it. He actually calls it tracking. If you listen to him speak, he wants to track progress from 3 years old to post-college. And think back to what I was talking about with the test. Mm-hmm. I call it a test, but it's really data collection. Do we really want to subject our children to data collection? Yeah. That's trying to move a monster. And there's nobody that's going to change that at point. All you can do as a parent is opt out. And I also get in trouble with fellow board members there because my children do not take state tests. No parent has to subject their child to an annual state test, whether it be math, English, science, or anything else. You have the right under Ed Code 60651, no notes,
right,
that allows you to excuse your child from any state testing because I don't need the state telling me where my children are. I know where they're at. One's a rock star and one needs help. I don't need the state to tell me different.
Right.
And I don't need you collecting data. I don't need you locking and loading on them. Modesto City Schools gives computers out to every single high school student. Every single high school student in the city has one except 2, the Walker children. I did not take the computers. I told them if you're doing computer work, it will be done at home.
Oh, let me ask you this then. So because all of those computers are probably connected to, or
they are connected,
so that's data collecting as well then.
At some level, and I've yet to dig into that because, again, as we just talked about, there's so much on the table at any given time for a school board member. And a part-time job that doesn't pay, which is where I'm a bit different because I dig deep. Right. I work my rear end off at this.
You do, John. I
40,
do know
50
that.
Hour, I mean, it's not a 5-hour-a-week job for me. I put 40-plus hours a week into this.
Well, I'm friends with you on Facebook. You put out what you do. I know how hard you work.
And so I do the research, and I have not had time to go back in and look at the privacy agreements between all the third-party vendors. And those, again, aren't specific to Modesto City Schools. They're up and down the state.
Yeah.
Everybody's using Power School and Schoology and all these different apps that allow you to see what's going on. Well, if I can see what's going on, who else can see? And the argument will come back and folks will say, well, your insurance provider knows too. And well, I gave that to them. Okay. And yes, it's at risk.
Yeah.
Every piece of data on the internet's at risk. But do I really need my students' data logged into CalPads, the California State database? And part of Common Core back in the day was every state built databases. There's longitudinal databases in all the states collecting data and funneling it back to D.C. And people go, well, FERPA's there, and FERPA was the privacy law to protect children's data.
What does FERPA stand
for? I can't remember what FERPA stands for. What FERPA was was put in place in the 80s to prevent states from pushing student data up to the federal level. It meant the states protected student data. The problem was then there wasn't technology. And so in the 70s and 80s, you didn't worry about the internet tubes. You weren't testing students on computers, right? Now everybody's online. FERPA doesn't take into account technology. And the Obama administration loosened the FERPA rules to allow some data to perk back up to the feds. And the biggest example I can give of that is the test again. SBAC. When they took the grant money to create the test, part of the rider on that contract was anything they got had to be sent back to D.C. to Department of Ed. And so it predates any California protections for data because their agreement was in place before California put in anything after that or anything that follows that. SBAC has their agreement with the state, not the state, the Federal Department of Education. And so that data is being funneled back. And FERPA allows that now because they loosen the regulations. So there's all sorts of things to be worried about. But how do you dig into that when you're trying to get English and math fixed? And so we don't necessarily talk about that, but it's on the to-do list. And it's a very tricky topic because people's heads will get unglued if I start digging too hard. I already make people nervous just by can you just our conversation here, you could see there's people twitching. You know, on Twitter, I surely make the State Board of Education isn't following me on Twitter because they think I'm their friend.
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, if you see me twitching, it's because I can't believe all this baloney. That's why I'm twitching. I hope you understand that.
No, it's difficult. And I think that's what's hard to educate parents on.
Yeah.
What do you think is the reason for the state or the federal government collecting all this data? What do they... Do you have any idea as to what they want to use it for?
I think we can all envision bad things.
Yeah.
I think that the problem is that collecting data on anything, you got to think about money. You know, does Google doesn't make their money other than collecting data and then selling that data. If we go back to sort of the beginning of this conversation, we talked about the SAT and David Coleman, and you fill out the little survey before the student takes the SAT test. He's selling it to the colleges, right?
That's right.
Okay. And so there's all these different things underneath it that should make everybody nervous. And I think it's not just related to education. It should be related to anything. I mean, they're having hearings in Congress in D.C. about what is Google collecting.
Right.
Right? What is Facebook doing with your data? What is Twitter doing with your data? Okay? These are all voluntary. These are things we do that we choose to do. Did you really know when you chose to go to school that you were going to be worried about your child's data? And I'm sure that we're doing everything possible to protect it, but do we know what those third-party privacy agreements are?
Yeah.
You know, I'm not a lawyer.
No.
I pretend to be one once a month at a board meeting. I call it, I have a little J and a little D. I'm not a full-blown JD lawyer, but I do a lot of homework, so I call it lowercase j, lowercase d. I understand ed code. I can read documents, but that doesn't mean that I understand the fine print on what has been shared. And what are we getting for free? Because I haven't gotten that far because there's a lot of things going on. But I think anybody giving you something for free, as I tell my children, you should be worried.
Yes.
My general statement to my children has been, if somebody gives you something for free, watch their other hand because it's going to hit you on the back of the head. You didn't get something for free. You just think you did.
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Does the federal government require states to feed them the data that they collect on students?
With the setup of the longitudinal database, yes. When I talked about that grant, and you have to go back in time now. You got to go back to 2013-14 when we were coming out of the Great Recession. And we got into this mess because essentially they blackmailed the states. You got to think about 8-9 when we're in the Great Recession. Everybody's broke. Housing crisis gone wild. And they got this money for the bailout when Bush was leaving office. They took a huge chunk of that and called it Race to the Top. And it was a grant program that sent money to the states. And when you took the money, you took the bargain that you would use the Common Core standards. The grant that went to create the SBAC test, and this goes right back to California. The test was created at UCLA with an organization called CREST. And CREST took the grant money that created the test with the bargain that data goes back to the DOE. And so the Department of Education has been getting that data for a long time. We have a database. It runs. There's a guy, a doctor, I'm going to forget the name. Point is that there was a picture and a thing that shows you this database warehousing thing out in Utah where it pipes into and goes back. They're collecting data on our children. Make no
On all
bones
of us.
about it.
Yeah.
Right.
No different than when you click on an ad on Google, it shows up on your Facebook feed.
Right.
Protections
Right.
or not, they are watching. And it should make everybody nervous.
Well, it certainly does me.
Yes. Wow.
Well, let's kind of move on and consider the fact that Jefferson will eventually become a state. And given your experience in California education and given a clean sheet of paper, how would you set up a education system in a...
The first thing we do is the thing I said I didn't like already, which would you need a state board of education and you need a state superintendent of education. They have to be elected, not appointed. And so you're going to elect your superintendent. And as you know, I brought the Constitution of California with me. Section 7 of the California Constitution says that the State Board of Education can be appointed or elected. They've decided to make it an appointed board, and so they're not accountable. And so if you've got a Constitution and you're going to give me a clean slate, then yes, you're going to work from your legislature is going to make your laws. You've got an executive in charge of your State Department of Education. You have a State Board of Education that is elected regionally. And so now you're answerable to people. I can find you. Very much like I said, if we make a policy and I have real local control and you don't like it, you can throw me out. If you think about all the things we've talked about wrong about what California's done, I think half of it would have been undone if we could throw people out of office. We can't throw the state board out of office. They're appointed. And I think if you think it, and the corollary argument would be the water board. Do you think the water board would be stealing our water the way they are if they were elected?
Not a chance.
No, you'd be gone. And if you think about it, a big, large board like that at the state level, certainly Jefferson would be smaller, it would be regional. And so you'd have representatives from the valley. And if you look at the Jefferson map, you'd have folks in different regions. Say you did 7.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson, if it had a 7-member state board of education, you'd be very easily get to your state board member. It's not that it's big, but it's not. You'd be able to find them. You know, if you took California now and made them elected, say you did 9, divvy the state up into 9 parcels. Don't do it by population, because then you still gave the Bay Area control, which goes back to your Jefferson argument that you have a guy that represents a Senate seat south of us. Berry Hill just left office. Anna Caballero sits there now. It's like 12 counties. She lives over by Salinas.
Right.
But she represents people 20, 45 minutes south of me. That's horrific. You don't have representation.
Yeah.
And so to me, education is a state super, an elected board regionally, down to the county offices. So you'd have a county board, just like we have now, and a county superintendent, and your local boards. So you have local control. Give the local school boards the control to do what they need. If you allow teachers creativity and allow them to be entrepreneurial, people think of entrepreneurial as business. Entrepreneurial is solving a problem a different way. And so if you empower teachers to get out of this standard-based market economy sort of education that says now we've gone from standards to test-based to now a workforce development, I don't need my child figuring out what they're doing in 7th grade for a career. I just need you to be able to read, write, and do arithmetic. You figure that out in due time. But that's the structure. You have the assembly making the laws, a state elected board, a state superintendent relaying to the counties, to the local boards of ed. Keep local control in place.
Well, that just makes sense, John. And
you do that.
You do make sense. You do make sense. And a lot of what is happening does not make sense. But the local issue, I think, is so good because nobody can solve an issue who have no idea what the problems are in those areas. Only the local people can do that. I like your idea. I think it's fantastic.
You're accountable that way because you can find them, right?
Exactly. There you go.
And it's part of what you guys talk about when you show the map and the misrepresentation and the lack of representation, which is why I got my Jefferson hat on. It's why I got my flag on my roof, is that we don't have representation. We really don't.
That's very true.
I mean, if like we just said, you look at the way they've divvied this thing up, the state of California is run by the Bay Area and SoCal.
Right.
Everybody else is a second thought. And it's because they've done it. All the population centers are there. They ignore us and they steal the water. They make the air regulations. You got a $70 billion super choo-choo to nowhere, right? And again, you're not taught. You've got you've got these big stanchions down in Fresno now where they've torn up the freeway that may never see a train. Do we really have $80 billion? No.
No, we don't.
We don't. I mean, on the education front, you can't even tell me how we're paying pensions. 4 years from now, our budget at the local level, 25 cents on every dollar will be going to a pension. That's a quarter of every dollar of funding.
Wow.
Which when we went back, remember we talked about $255.1 billion over 4 years? Mm-hmm. A lot of that's people.
Yeah.
And by the time we pay the teachers and pay the pensions, what's left for the students? Not as much as you think.
Right.
And so you've got to get back to being physically conservative, managing your money correctly, putting pieces in place that allow the electorate to hold the elected officials accountable. I want people to hold me accountable. I want everybody to be held accountable. The problem is the people that have made the rules that we're living under now aren't accountable because they don't have to be.
Well, nobody's really asked them to be.
No, and again, nobody does is why I said State Board of Ed follows me on Twitter because I probably make them nervous. Because I don't know who else bangs on them, but I'm guessing there aren't a whole lot of school board members in California who every time the state board comes up with an idea that I think is flawed, hits them in 184 characters at 90 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And I do.
You do.
If the CDE pops its head up or the State Board of Ed pops its head up, I whack back because you can't, they peddle bad facts, and they disguise and I call it the fog. They hide the real problem in the fog of what we see in the news. When you talk about in the news now, what do you see in education? Equity. All they talk about is we're not serving the at-risk students. We're not helping Hispanics. We're not helping African Americans. We're not doing this. Those aren't new problems. Those problems have existed since time immemorial. But if you keep talking about them in a state that's all Democrats all the time, who loves restorative justice and feel they're being oppressed, then they've got something to resist. And we're not talking about math and English and science and history and civics and the Constitution and the things that me and you did when me and you were in school back in the day. And if we get that right, which shouldn't be that difficult to do, we're not talking about rocket science here.
Basics.
It is. And there's ways to do this if you establish local control and accountability. You don't have accountability when your senator represents 12 counties all the way to Salinas to the foothills.
Yes.
Absolutely.
We agree with that.
That's also probably partly due to gerrymandering.
Is that and it's the population centers, because like you talk about in the Jefferson idea, you just keep expanding. Each senator represents so many million people.
Right.
Well, if you're basing it on population, then the population centers run the table. And then those of us who live out in the valley, and I'm not an ag guy, but I love agriculture, and I have lots of farmers who are friends of mine, and I love food. And for the people out there, it doesn't come from the grocery store. You just think it does. It comes from the farmers. And all those different things that are going on out there, whether to agriculture and water and the mountains, and those are important issues. Our forest management. I mean, just look at what we just dealt with the fire season again.
Absolutely.
And how much money did we spend putting out fires that we could have spent managing the forest that would have mitigated the fire in the first place?
Absolutely.
But the eco warriors said no. And that puts you back to the population centers in the Bay Area and Southern California running roughshod over everybody, whether it be education, water, air, trains, everything. And so we get discounted. And it's not fair, and it doesn't lead to good governance. Look at the state policies. Up and down this state, it's a mess. Look at housing prices. People are leaving. Businesses are leaving. Overregulation. Education's overregulated if you do what you're told. There's ways to get around it.
Right.
But as we've talked about, that requires convincing 3, 4, 5, 6 more people to agree and push back.
That's right.
Yeah.
Not an easy thing to do.
I think, speaking about the state of Jefferson, we're probably going to be coming into those issues real soon, trying to hash out the differences that we have, I mean, we're all human beings. We all have different ideals. So we're going to have some different ways we want this state to be run. So
I think that's the middle ground, though.
Yeah.
That's what we talked about earlier, where you look for a middle ground.
Right.
Right? Because folks will go, because it's a nonpartisan board, and Lord knows I'm a Republican, and I sit with Democrats. But there's 7 of us up there, and we have found a way to work together. You know, and that requires that I give, and they give, and we end up in a place that says, well, here's where we can agree. And let's do that first, and then we'll come back and work on the harder problems later, one bite at a time. And you don't get swallowed by the whale of policy, because it's easy to get lost in the weeds. But if you take it one bite at a time, and if there's anything I say about math, what math teaches you, and people go, well, everybody's not going to be a math guy. I said, I'm not necessarily a math guy. I have a math degree. What math teaches you is to take a big problem, break it into smaller pieces, small one piece at a time, and then put it back together.
Yeah.
And that's where algebra and math and logic and critical thinking come into place. And if we all did more of that, we'd be in such a better place.
Logic. You're logical. Wow.
Well, I'm just wondering if now that you have compatibility amongst your board members, how much of that perhaps is due to common sense?
I think a lot of it's due to common sense. It's also part of sort of what we talked about, where you have to put aside what you can. Everybody runs for office on a platform. Not all of us are billionaire Trumpy guys, so you can't just run wild. It requires building trust and consensus between 6, 7 people, and that takes time. And you have to go through issues together. And I think that having gone through 2 different labor negotiations, we've all been called names. I mean, there was a long stretch when I first got elected where we were being told that we were racially biased and this and that, and we didn't care about people of color, which is really crazy because, yes, I'm a bald white Republican guy, but my dad's African-American who married my mom in the South because I'm from Georgia in the 70s. I understand racial issues better than most.
You certainly would.
My wife is Hispanic, but it didn't stop people from calling us names, which hurts. Nobody wants to be called a racist.
No.
Nobody wants to be told they don't care about people, and nobody doesn't care about children on that board. And through that process, you tend to bond together because you look left and you look right. And I don't believe it. There's people that I didn't agree with, but I don't think anybody's up there going, I'm going to malign somebody because I don't like the way you look. It just isn't how we think. And so you build trust, you build consensus, and we move forward.
Good.
And we have a new superintendent, and the hope is as we go through the next year or so that we continue to do good things. I'm going to give this probably one more round, which will probably wear me out because they extended our terms 1 year because of even year elections.
Oh, yes.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so instead of coming up in 19, I'll come up in 20. If I did another 4, that would be 9 years. 9 years would probably warp my mind, and I probably need a break after that.
You will.
But I think we have a good group. We've got a gentleman on the south side, Mr. Lopez, who represents the south side of town, Hispanics.
Mm-hmm.
Our previous board member resigned because he didn't like our choice on superintendent, and he quit. And so we appointed another individual.
Mm-hmm.
Turned out he was another educator who's African American. So we've got 3 women, an African American, a Hispanic, and then me, who's a mix of all.
Right.
And so we've got a really unique setup. And the hope is that we continue to work together and do good things and spend the bond money right. And
Thank you, John.
And do right by the city. Because I think there's enough examples out there locally of people making a mess of things because they keep getting too deep or too wide, or they're not listening to the right people, or they're doing too much.
Mm-hmm.
Education is one rail, right? It's not running a city. It's not running a county. It's just one topic.
Right.
Can we get that right and show folks what a good governance team looks like and take care of something and improve children's outcomes and potentially, yes, push back and do some things differently? But we have unique problems. You know, we all live in this valley. We're Appalachia poor. And people don't like to hear that, but it's the God's honest truth.
We are.
When you
Yeah.
look at the south side of this town, you go into Madera and Merced and Tulare and certain parts of Fresno and certain parts of San Joaquin and Stockton. We are Appalachia poor, and we're not getting support from the state we need, which means we got to get really creative and make hard decisions. And if we're going to add something, we got to cut something. And the bond gives us a bit more flexibility given the pensions. And the hope is that we can do some good things together. Because at the end of the day, if you run for office, the goal is to do something good and not always get screamed at and get called names and be told that you're doing the wrong thing, which is a lot of what you hear most days.
You are working so hard, John. I really, really appreciate that. You are doing that. So I want you to know that from me. I feel that way. And
well, I would certainly agree with you, Pat. John has done a marvelous job. Just in the 4 years,
It's only been 3.
3.
has it been 3?
We're just starting year 4 now.
Okay.
And so, yes,
Yeah.
November starts the beginning of year 4. So,
Yeah, I was thinking.
and so
it was 4.
I've got 2 left. I've got this year and next year. And again, the hope is that things work out. You know, I think one of the things that some folks say is we shouldn't have gone into district areas because now we have smaller areas like city councils.
Yeah.
And so we're running in trustee areas. And it's much harder to win when I ran originally because it was at large. And so it was much more difficult.
Oh.
And so the hope is that, yes, it's a smaller area and it makes it easier to throw money at something. So theoretically, somebody could come in with money and take a board member out. The hope is the community believes in you.
Yeah.
And that in a smaller trustee area, I am representing my neighbors. And I am at the high school with students who go to school. And you do recognize that I am out there with the marching bands, and I'm at your high school doing diplomas, and I'm trying to help with math. And it's easier to go out to your neighbors and say, look, didn't get everything done, but I got an E for effort, and I never stopped trying. And I think if more people did that with just a clear conscience and just say, it's not about me, it's about the kids.
I
Precisely.
wish we had more people like that in our government,
Yeah, I
John.
do
I
too.
really do. I really, really do. Yes. Another question?
Well, I was going to quiz you about the superintendent of schools, the state superintendent of schools. You said that he really doesn't have much in the way of responsibility.
He doesn't have power. He has responsibility. He's responsible for running the California Department of Education. His marching orders come from the state board.
Okay.
And so, yes, he has statutory responsibility to run the State Department of Education, and they'll go out and they'll decide curriculum. He can't pick it. The state board has to approve it. And so it's a toothless job.
Yeah.
In the sense that, and it's weird to watch how they ran this election and how much money they threw at it. They say it was the most expensive state superintendent education race ever. And you had two Democrats running. One was pro-charter, Marshall Tuck, and then the guy that won, whose name escapes me because I have a mental block because I don't like him.
Yep.
He came through the CTA background. And it's interesting because he was a board member in West Contra Costa County. So he was a school board member before he became an assembly member, and he was a teacher before that. And so CTA runs him, essentially. Either way, you've got a special interest group running this. His history as a school board member was not anything to smile about. It was quite tragic, and one of the guys I listened to a lot as far as reading and listening to was Dr. Bill Evers. And Dr. Bill Evers was an assistant secretary of education under Bush. And he was a Santa Clara County Board of Ed member at one point. Now he's in Southern California. He wrote an interesting piece essentially pointing out why he's not qualified for the job, and he's not. But the money was there, and he runs the department, but the power is still with the appointed board. And so what they say goes.
Yeah.
He doesn't have the ability to override them. He doesn't have the ability to do anything but go to them for approval. They tell you what to do. And it's very similar with the legislature, because they'll say, well, the legislature passed the rules. Well, do you really think the legislature is writing ed code? No. The State Board of Education is telling the legislature what to do. They're doing what they're told, and so everybody's taking their marching orders from an appointed board with complete cover because they're unaccountable, and all you have to do is say, well, we did what the board wanted. And that's how we get in this mess.
Well, you think that's an appropriate way? Maybe
No.
The state board should not be involved in telling the legislature how to.
Well, I think they're going to do it no matter what, because that's how this is. I mean, I think you do, but I think you make the state board accountable. I do think to a certain degree the legislature and the State Board of Ed should work together. But I think if they're working together and everybody's accountable, you're much less likely to pull some monkey business like we got now.
Yeah.
Okay? You wouldn't have gotten this far with the Common Core thing, and it's interesting because folks will rebrand this. California can't rebrand. You passed Common Core. It's in the legislation. It's the math standards, the California Common Core mathematics standards. You passed Common Core in the legislation. It's there. It's in the law. And you did what you were told because that's what they got brought to us. And the previous president, Michael Kirst, wanted it anyway. And so he was mixed up with Gates way back in the day at Stanford. Gates has got his fingers in everything.
Yeah.
And there's nothing he's ever done philanthropically that's ever worked.
That's right.
The guy's got more money than the dog has fleas on a hot summer day.
Yeah.
But he's never spent money on anything that's worked right other than the computers, whether it be his vaccine programs or the other things he does around the world, or education, which has been a long bit with him. He's been fitzing around in education for decades. It's never worked out.
Yeah, he sees himself as quite a wonderful man who's done absolutely nothing.
No, he's done
in
damage.
reality.
He's
damage.
He's admitted that it's a failure, but he goes right back in with his money.
That. I read that.
He's written that it didn't work, but what did he do? Instead, he takes his big pocketbook, and instead of trying to do something nationally, he goes into communities and drops a boatload of money.
Mm-hmm.
And we just talked about how tight school budgets are. If you're tight on a budget, you're much more likely to take something from a billionaire, unless you're me.
Yeah.
At which point I say anything free is a no, because I'm looking for the other hand to hit me in the back of the head.
That's right.
And
That's
it's
where it'll
exactly
come
what
from.
happens, is that I'd rather get along with less and get it right than take more and get it wrong.
That's a good way to live your life in general, just in general, huh?
Well, desperation will drive people to do desperate things, and certainly.
And remember, he got his start when the Great Recession started.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
All this stuff comes rolling out right after Obama gets elected.
Mm-hmm.
He takes No Child Left Behind. And keep in mind what the complaint was that you passed a test. And so everybody was testing. And the argument was we're teaching to the test. And so what Common
Barbara Bush was that.
They all went. The Bushes went way back.
All the Bushes.
Jeb did a whole lot of damage in Florida to boot. And so they've got a history of this. The complaint was that you had a test, but it wasn't standardized enough.
Oh.
And so Common Core took it to the next level and said, you don't have enough standards. And so they standardized it even more.
Right.
And everybody was broke because you're in the Great Recession. California was a train wreck because our housing parcels, who was worse, California or Florida? You know, which of those two states was in worse of a housing mess during the Great Recession? It was both of us. You know, and California was a nightmare. And, you know, we lived out here in the valley, foreclosure capital of California, between Stockton.
Right, it was.
Because you had all the folks from the Bay Area out here buying $500,000 homes that couldn't afford them. Leverage to the hilt.
Yep.
And so when somebody comes in and offers you a couple $1 billion and you take the bait, now you're fish on. And Gates knew that, and he wasn't an idiot, and it was his shot to get his foot in the door. Here we are 10 years later, and I would argue that it has not worked, is not working, and if you continue to follow this mechanistic sort of assembly line approach to education, which you've now built a workforce model where it's all about career, hey, you figure out your career later, it's going to fail. You put one model on top of another, and none of them are compatible. And you've thrown so much money at it that you can't admit you made a mistake. Put your pride away and cut bait.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you like that?
Put your pride away and cut bait.
Yeah.
It's too difficult for people to admit they made a mistake.
Fish or cut bait?
People do not like to admit they made a mistake, and especially an expensive one.
Yeah. Well, you know, say the state of Jefferson actually comes to fruition, as we certainly are working hard to do. Would you consider getting involved with education in the state of Jefferson?
I'd love to start over from scratch. I think the idea essentially is that sort of what we just talked about is you think you know what you're doing when you're running for office, and then you get there and you realize you didn't, right? Because you have to learn. You're drinking through a fire hose. I think I've learned so much, and I've got so many good mentors over time. Dr. Skotsky, Zev Werman, Hoover Institute, guys like Bill Evers, just all the different folks that I've learned and listened to, that what they've said and what I've experienced and what I've had to go through, and as I've learned, that how do you put that to use? You know, here I can help tell you what mistakes I've made and what mistakes I've seen others make. Yeah. And then my background sort of as a history buff, what did our constitutional founding fathers get right? Keep a broad framework that keeps the government accountable. You can put pieces in place, and to be part of something like that will be phenomenal, because you can go back and say, we're not going to make that mistake. You know, we can get this right and still allow people the freedom to make mistakes, but we don't force mistakes on them from on high. And I think that's the trick, is empowering people to govern and keeping them accountable to the people who put them there. If we get that part right, we're back to what our founding fathers said. Constitutional republic. You have people who are accountable, and there's a way to keep them accountable, and there's a way to change it if something goes wrong, versus we're going to keep pounding down the same road.
Right.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for your very valuable input. This has been a real educational moment for us.
Yeah.
If
every time I talk to John, I'm educated. That's for sure.
Hopefully we didn't go too far in the weeds.
I don't think so. I think you did an excellent job. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you for having me, and I'm always available, more or less, depending on how hard it is to catch me on a given time.
Yeah.
I think we'll have you come back on another occasion.
I think so. I think that would be a very good idea.
Always willing. Here or the bear.
Right.
I don't think Marie likes it when I call it the bear, but I just call it the bear.
All right. Yeah. It's okay.
Well, thank you again, John.
Thanks again, John.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thanks so much, John, for coming onto our show. If you are interested in sponsoring our show, or know of anybody who may be interested in sponsoring our show, you can head over to jeffersonlibertyradio.com or email us at sponsors@jeffersonlibertyradio.com. We would love your support and really need it to keep this show running. We'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Email us at feedback@jeffersonlibertyradio.com or via our website again, jeffersonlibertyradio.com. We'd love to hear your questions and comments and feedback. Don't forget to subscribe to us on iTunes if you aren't already, or your podcast player of choice. Leave us a 5-star review. We'd really appreciate it, and it really does help our ratings. You can find us on all the typical social media, Facebook, Twitter, also Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and even some alternative media, such as BitChute and Gab. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Jefferson Liberty Radio, and we'll catch you in the next episode.